This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the first week of May 2015. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani. Inside our New York City studio, the A-Team is back. How about that? Great to have them back. We're very excited about today's show, and of course, there's a lot to talk about. You know, guys, every Monday I finish the MMA Hour, and I say to myself, what in the world am I going to talk about on Thursday? There's nothing to talk about. We just covered it all. And then something crazy happens on Tuesday or Wednesday. And that's the case this week, once again.
UFC Hall of Fame, baby.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We have a lot to discuss on this episode of The Beat. I hope that you are well wherever you are, and thank you very much for joining us on this Thursday afternoon, especially if you're watching the show live. You know these guys. This is Luke Thomas of MMAfighting.com and the SiriusXM Fight Club. That is Jeff Wagenheim, the man with the shirt of SportsIllustrated.com, and back anchoring the show, the man with the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. By the way, is it the man with the hat or the man in the hat, the man with the shirt, the man in the shirt? I'm not quite sure.
It is what it is.
I feel like I change it.
It is what it is.
It is what it is.
It's the two donks to my left.
Yes. Very well said. All right, guys, let's talk about the big news of the week. Finally, we have answers to the questions we've been waiting for. In December, the UFC announced their new 6-year deal with Reebok, that they would be the exclusive outfitter and apparel company for the UFC, that there would be a uniform, for lack of a better word, come July. But we couldn't really, at least I felt, I know we talked about this on the show, we couldn't really weigh in on this because there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered. At the end of the day, we needed to know how much the fighters would be making off of this deal. Well, on Tuesday, we found out. At around noon Eastern time, all the fighters were sent an email with the breakdown. You know the breakdown, champions getting $40,000 and newcomers getting $2,500, and then the rest is somewhere in between. And the reaction has been very interesting to follow. What's your take on the numbers? Do you think these numbers are fair, or do you think that the fighters are getting the short end of the stick?
Yeah, there's not a lot of complimentary things I have to say about it, unfortunately. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be that way set in stone. I truly believe, and I've said this on Twitter and other places, I believe with a few tweaks, it could be a completely different system. And we can get to that at some point. But as it stands, you know, just putting it bluntly, I find the numbers appalling.
Why?
I find them totally appalling. Because the main question was, look, if you want to, okay, I mean, there's so many problems with this thing. I mean, I don't even know where to begin and end, okay? But look, the central question is as follows. Are you putting back what you are taking out, or are you not? And there is very little evidence that they are doing that. And if they're not doing that, well, that is hugely problematic, isn't it? These guys, now again, there are clearly portions of the fighter roster that do benefit from this. And if you look at some of the breakdowns, preliminary ones anyway, that folks have done, the majority of UFC fighters, especially in a expanded, globalized age where, you know, there was more UFC debuts this year than any other year ever, most fit into that 1 to 5 fight category that nets you $2,500. And I think some of those guys or women will have benefit because they'll say, look, I couldn't chase down sponsors or whatever the case may be. But even then, many of them won't benefit. Josh Salmon fits into that category. He wrote a piece on Bloody Elbow saying this was, in his words, and in italicized, a dramatic, I think, expansive weight cut, you know, unbelievable. And I just feel like, look, how is this in any way a surprise? Even if you say to yourself, okay, let's assume that UFC acted in good faith. Truly, let's and not even because that's like theoretical, but like probably actual. They said, let's try and get the fighters a good deal here. This is what we believe to be a good deal for them. Well, what you believe to be a good deal for them is utterly irrelevant. It's what they believe is a good deal for them, what they could vote on should something like that be possible, or what collectively, what every single one might say. That's why you have to have two sides negotiating. If you have one side picking for the other, especially when one gains as the other loses, they're never going to say what the other party is going to say, even if they're trying their best to do it. So I could go on, but there's a lot to get to. I'll just say, for me, I find the whole thing very problematic.
Yeah, you said when you were introducing this topic that this deal was announced in December. Well, it was only yesterday when we first heard any of the details. And I was at first thinking, well, it's interesting that the fighters are now coming out and talking about the details, but then I realized quickly that they were just learning the details. And that, you know, gets to what Luke started talking about. if this were in any other sport where there's some association of fighters, a union, whatever you want to call it, this would have been collectively bargained, and the fighters would have known before December, before this deal was consummated, that this is the structure of what we're going to agree to. It might not have looked that different. Who knows? I mean, it's hard to know exactly what fighters are going to agree to, especially since they all are at different stages of their career. There's a lot of factors that would go into that. But at least if the fighters were able to negotiate together, there would be some power. What if somebody right now, we've been seeing all these tweets from fighters saying, I think this is a raw deal, I don't like it. Well, what are they going to do about it? Is somebody just going to show up and for the fight in I guess it's the 189 is the first one. Is somebody going to show up at the first press event wearing Adidas or Nike? And if that's the case, what's going to happen to them? Well, they're probably going to get some kind of stiff fine and get in trouble. But if all the fighters in that card decided collectively, we don't think this is a good deal for us, and we're all going to do something to take some kind of action, there's much more strength in numbers.
Well, this is the type of thing that if there's going to be a union or something, this might galvanize action towards that. I find it, it's like realistically what the UFC did in announcing this is say, hey, look, there's a big picture that we're focusing on here. But that's completely at odds with everybody who's basically on the roster right now. They always talk about the window of time that you can actually compete in and make the money. And suddenly you're telling these guys like, hey, you're taking a bullet now for the next generation, or you're taking a bullet for the next group of fighter, whatever it is, because these guys, they're in there right now. They're seeing these numbers, and that's really where they're getting offended. So to me, that it just you're asking your employees of right now to do that, and that doesn't.
Independent contractors.
Well, independent. Yes. So you're asking your independent contractors to acknowledge that and to live by it, and I feel like that's right now a big part of the problem. The other thing is like this is an individual sport. These guys, you talk to any of these fighters, they got in here because they had control of themselves. That they didn't want to play a team sport. They want to control. That's why they fight. It's just them. Suddenly you're taking a piece of their control away from them. If they're enterprising even on the outside, able to go out and get their own sponsors. Some people like that hustle. Some management like that hustle. They were able to put, a lot of guys were able to find a lot more money by just doing that. And suddenly you take away that control and you assign them a value. Well, that's going to be a slap in the face, especially when that scale shows up the way it did.
And also, it was unnecessary, I think, to make this the exclusive face of the UFC, the Reebok products. Sure, it gives a I don't know, more major league look if you've got fighters in some sort of uniform, just the way it is in all the team sports. Athletes compete in uniforms. Fine. So put all the fighters in some kind of Reebok gear when they're competing. But to take away the opportunity for fighters who wish to find other sponsors, to take away that opportunity, I think that's where a big issue is. If this were the I don't know, the sort of the basis upon which fighters could build their money, that's fine. If you said, okay, you're only going to make $2,500 for this fight because that's where you fall, well, then I've got to go out and find some other sponsors in order to make up the difference.
Important to note, obviously, that the fighters can keep their sponsors. The UFC will remind you of this, but let's be honest, how many of these sponsors are going to stick around if they can't be a part of Fight Week? They can't be a part of anything leading up to the fight or the fight itself. And I'm happy you brought up the other organizations, the other leagues, right? Because we always hear, well, this is our way of becoming like the NFL and the NBA. This comparison makes no sense because until the fighters have the same rights that the NFL players and NBA players have, you can't compare it. You can't say that you want to look like the NFL and NBA when the fighters aren't treated like NBA and NFL players. I'm all on board with the idea of trying to make the sport more professional and make it look like the NFL and NBA, but there needs to be both sides of the equation there.
I just find the whole thing just an absurd premise. Like, when Mayweather walked out with the effing Burger King, did anyone go, well, this is totally unprofessional, you're not going to get my money? Like, combat sports is a carny show on some level. Like, an individualization is what it thrives on. People like that Vanderlei Silva, it's just a gesture, but the hand roll he used to do, and Melvin Manhoff with the
Individuality.
Roman Gladiator shorts, like this idea, this was like, oh, everyone got NASCAR'd up. This was not a problem that ever needed to be solved. Like if you polled MMA fans about what they cared about, it would be at the bottom of the list. Now, maybe executives have a different feel, and I understand that. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that there's going to be some level of uniformity, but it's not actually a problem.
Well, I'll actually go on the other side of the coin and say it actually helped the fighters in the sense that, and I think we've talked about it on this particular show, Demetrius Johnson's deal with Microsoft helped his identity. Yeah. It was part of who he was. He was a gamer from the Northwest. And then in his last fight in Montreal, he was a guy wearing some Joe Schmo's face on his shirt. And it actually hurt me to see that. Now Demetrius Johnson looked like everyone else, and that's a guy who needs to be unique, more so than others, right?
Totally.
And now he lost that. He lost that Microsoft, that green. That was who he was. He was the only one that had that. And so I feel uncomfortable every time when we talk about this being like the NFL and NBA because it's not. And in the NFL and NBA, there are 30 different owners. In this league, there are a few owners, but they're the ones who they all work together, right? I mean, the UFC is part owned by several people, but they're all under the same umbrella. It's not Jerry Jones and Daniel Snyder and Pagula in Buffalo. So I don't like that comparison. If we're going to try to clean up the sport, great, let's clean up the sport. Let's make it like the NFL and NBA. But let's give the fighters those same rights. And then, just to add this, when this email came out, when this news came out of the breakdown, I had a ton of people reach out to me, fighters and managers, saying, "Can you believe this crap? Can you believe this? Can you believe this?" A lot of people were upset, more so than not, to be honest. And some of them were saying to me, "Well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do, Ariel? Are you going to stick up for us? Are you going to come out and say?" And I said, "What are you going to do about it? I'm tired of the fighters just thinking that a tweet is enough, right? It's not enough to tweet. It's great. You'll get a few RTs and a few favorites. But guys, if you really want to change something, do something about it. Tweets aren't enough. Interviews aren't enough. Do something about it. In fact, I would go as far as say, tweets are useless at this point. It just kind of looks like, it's not professional. It's not the way you should go about doing things. And we can say things, we can have discussions, we could talk, but at the end of the day, it's not on us. Because A, we didn't know how much they were making to begin with. I mean, who knows how much Brendan Schaub was making in his last fight for sponsorship? We don't know, only he knows. And so only he can really say how much he's losing, and he needs to speak up and tell the UFC, look guys, I was making this much, I'm now losing this much. It's up to them. It's not just on the media.
Yeah, and jumping off of that, what you earlier said, it'd be great if the UFC wants to look like a major league organization to give rights to the fighters. Well, the UFC doesn't give rights to fighters. The NFL didn't give rights to its football players. The NBA didn't give rights. Major League Baseball, none of these organizations gave rights. The athletes, now this is a sport that's about 20 years old and change. The athletes in these other sports, generations went by without the athletes getting together and creating a voice that's bigger than each individual. So, but it is incumbent upon them, as you said. It's not really up to the UFC they want to act in the best interest of themselves and their fighters, but it really is up to the individual fighters to say, well, how are we going to have a voice? Well, the best way for me to have a voice is to join with this guy and join with this guy, and maybe we can get some change.
And by the way, it is true that the UFC held meetings since December at every event to explain people, and they were receptive. I mean, they did change the rankings to tenure.
But this means nothing. This means nothing.
No, but the point is, that could only go so far. If the UFC's not going to be like, hey guys, do you want to collectively bargain this thing?
Right,
they're not going to do that.
I mean, listen, UFC has a business to run,
Yeah.
and they're going to run it. And you can all say, I believe that for example, they had said, I think Fox Sports had the detail that there's going to be additional one other sponsor on top of the Reebok uniforms that the fighters don't get a single cut of.
Yeah.
Not a red cent. You got Chris Weidman who's going to go out there and let's say it's Monster. I don't know who it went. It might be it's Sony. I don't know. Whatever. It's Winn-Dixie, the grocery chain, whoever it is. You mean to tell me that they're going to go out there, they're going to wear this over and over again, and the fighters don't get a single solitary cent of that? That is unbelievable. But guess what? If there's no one to collectively bargain with, they're just going to march forward like every other business in the world is going to do. What the UFC is doing, I'm sorry, it's the world we live in. You may not like it, you may hate it. This is reality. If they don't have anyone across the table from them that's going to force them to do it, they're just going to march all the way like Sherman to Atlanta and do whatever they want.
It does feel like a moment in time, though, where a lot of people at the same time are coming to this thought. I mean, when you do look at social media and you see all the types of complaints that are going on, then you feel like certain people are probably emboldened by this moment. If ever there was going to be a time, it might be something like this where everybody is affected at the exact same time, and a call to action like that would be the only way to sort of
who's
to go about it.
Let's look at the voices publicly, at least.
It's true, publicly. But you do get you like you were saying, behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of disgruntled managers. There's a lot of disgruntled fighters. And if that's really the case, if there's this burbling underneath, I feel like if ever there's going to be a time, it would be something like this, where you're being told, you're being dictated to as to what your worth is. And that's when people actually usually get in, forum action is when something like this happens.
The major issue is, can you get the top draw, can you get, Conor McGregor at this point to fall in line with what Cody Gibson wants? That's the problem that these fighters face, and that's the hurdle that I don't see them overcoming, because let's be honest.
He's a Reebok athlete, or he's not.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that in a second, but let's be honest, a lot of these guys are selfish, and they should be. They deserve to be. I mean, the fight game is a very small period of your life, and try to make as much money as you can, especially when you have families to feed and all that stuff. But can you get all these guys in line? Plus, it costs a lot of money to do something like that.
I think you can.
You can.
Kurt Flood, even when he attempted to do what he was doing, what eventually became free agency and all that, there was plenty of pushback during his time as well. The cards are stacked against them. I don't deny it would have to happen in Las Vegas if there was some sort of association or union, or Nevada anyway, and all kinds of bad things could happen. But I don't think it's impossible. But
do the fighters want this?
I think some do. I don't think they know what. It's just so disorganized, and the infighting is so crazy. And as you mentioned, it's like either infighting or retweeting each other, and nothing in between. And again, look, when SB Nation cuts me a check, it's like, okay, so you're going to lobby on behalf of fighters this day? Like, no, it never happens. My job, your job, everyone's job. The sports. I mean, I don't know what Sports Illustrated pays you for, if I'm just being honest. But I'm teasing. But I mean. They don't pay you to lobby. They just pay you to talk about what you see in the most honest and forthright way you can. Any kind of next step is entirely up to them. I just don't know that until, Tim Kennedy's out there being like, "What's up, Bellator?" And that's funny and that's cool. But at the end of the day, like, what does it mean? It means nothing.
And also,
and by the way, last thing I want to say about this, like, this is just like the NBA and the NFL. Much as it pains me to say this, Robert Griffin III actually is an employee of the Washington Redskins. He is not an independent contractor, so that kind of changes the equation a little bit here.
And also, how do you feel about the fact that, at this point, to a degree, a very small degree, we are public figures, I guess. People know who we are. People follow you on Twitter.
People know who you are.
But my point is, if you were unhappy with what SB Nation was paying you, would you go to Twitter and complain about it?
No.
So why would someone else? Why would another public figure do that? Is that the best way of fixing this problem?
Because I don't think.
To me, it just seems like you're just trying to piss them off.
Okay, but in this sense, I'll defend them, right? Maybe you guys disagree. I don't think they know what to do, and maybe they
have managers, most of them.
But also,
No?
the other thing is, when one fighter does it, maybe it just sets in motion other people thinking, well, maybe I'll do the same thing, and it's not the solution, but it might be the first shot fired, and then the second shot fired, and a few people start putting these things out there, and people start realizing. I noticed when I got this morning, I was looking over Twitter, and I hadn't been paying as much attention yesterday. I'm noticing, all the different names of people. Now I know it's not all the top people, but there's a lot of numbers of people who are voicing their opinions about this. And you get those big masses, and then maybe you get one person who's a top 5, or even maybe you get a champion, and then it snowballs. But this is not the solution. I agree with you. It's not going on Twitter and complaining. But at least it shows that there's some that people are willing to go public with it. That's enough.
Unprecedented in a sense that I don't recall this many active fighters criticizing the organization,
that
right?
Is true.
Right.
So it's unprecedented in that sense, but I just, it's not enough. It's not enough to tweet. If you're truly unhappy about it, you can't rely on us. You can't rely on the fans. You can't rely on your fellow fighters to just retweet you. It's a very juvenile way of thinking about things. Like, this is not the way. You have to write letters. You have to get meetings. You have to sit down and say, look, guys, we didn't agree to this, and we don't like these terms.
It's more than that. And the fact that I've said this before, the fact of the matter is, a couple of them are going to have to fall on their sword.
Yeah.
And they are waiting for someone else to do it, because that's a painful way to go. Not quite literally, of course, but someone's career is just going to have to be basically derailed or badly impacted, or several people's careers are going to have to be badly impacted for anyone else to benefit. And no one is willing at this point, understandably, to go and step up. Because who wants to be tied up in court forever?
Right.
Who wants to deal with millionaire lawyers finding every trick in the book to make things difficult for you? Nobody. So they just rather just say, well, you know what? I'll just keep going.
Kurt Flood wasn't the first baseball player to find that things weren't right in baseball. He wasn't the first guy that ever thought that, but it wasn't until he took some action. So yeah, you're right. Someone is gonna have to. It might be a career ender, or it might be something that just derails somebody, or it might be something where they end up being celebrated by their peers. Who knows? Who knows?
And there's talk of this component to the deal where there are some Reebok athletes, right? I mean, everyone has the Reebok deal that they have to deal with, but then there are the special athletes in a way. And yesterday on the conference call, they said that is 100% Reebok's call. And if that's the case, fine. I'm okay with that. But it just kind of feels like the cool kids club, Like these are the ones that we have zeroed in on that are going to get extra. And the rest don't have the ability to match these people. You know what I mean? Like, these guys are going to get extra because it's Reebok, but the others can't go out there and try to go tit for tat. They can't say, oh, I'm going to get Adidas. You're getting this from Reebok. So now it just feels like, okay, Ronda's got it, and Connor's got it, and this guy's got it from,
all the pillars.
Europe. Yeah.
You want to step up for the.
Now it just feels even more incestuous.
And isn't, correct me if I'm wrong, Demetrius Johnson is in the cohort where, he can't get any additional money. Like, he's had so many WC or UFC fights that he is maxed out. You know what I mean?
Oh, he may have over 20. I mean, he's champion.
So he can't go any higher than he's got if Reebok doesn't come and throw him a life raft. Like that, he's just sort of maxed out at that point, which to me seems like, okay, here's another. This is not a feature, this is a bug of the system.
And, you brought up that extra sponsor. When they brought that up yesterday, I was like, oh, okay, this is the opening. This is like, hey guys, we're giving you one opportunity, Wild West, go out there and make what you can make. You know what I mean?
Right.
But then they said that they don't get a cut of it. I think I feel like I would have been okay with it given the current nature of today's sponsorship game. If they said there's one spot open for you to do whatever you want, you could go to Burger King or you can go to Joe's Deli. You have one opportunity, tax-free, right? I feel like I would have been okay with it in this, given climate, right? Do you agree with me, or
I'd be much more okay with it, but I still think that would be falling short.
Yeah.
Here's what I would say. Look, and this is all, I don't know what they're going to do, right? You could say make it an opt-in program. That would be, you have a lot of guys. I mean, again. What
do you mean by that?
It wouldn't be required of you to do it. You could elect to do it under what the program is offered, and you might find that, remember, the majority of the guys who are fighting in the UFC are in that $2,500 bracket. So they may just say, you know what? I'll take the deal. And you'll still have a ton of Reebok saturation during the course of the broadcast. Or you say, everyone has to do it, but you can have up to 3 sponsors, which we will clear. Similar to the sponsor tax, if not from a sort of administrative point. But just to be like, you get this, and you get only this, and in many cases, this is a fraction of what you previously earned. And by the way, it doesn't just affect you, since everyone around you gets a cut of that, it affects your manager, it affects your trainer, it affects your training partners, it affects your training camp, it affects your gym, because now all of them are going to be on a diet as well. This has ramifications for everyone in the industry. Fact, not up for dispute. Everyone takes a cut. It's not the fighters taking a cut, it's everyone who is involved with the fighter taking a cut. And so, to me, I just don't understand when you have people grumbling about low fighter pay, but you got bonuses and you got sponsors, you are now tampering down on the things that offset low fighter pay. What? Like, what is happening here? I just don't get it. So if they've given another sponsor, yeah, cool, man. That's still falling way short of where we're supposed to be.
I wonder if we're barking up the wrong tree because, it sounds like there are a lot of people complaining, but it really, when you think about it, there are 586 fighters on the roster. In the grand scheme of things, yesterday, how many people were complaining? 2%, if that?
Sure.
Right? So where are the others? If they're not complaining, what are they doing?
Again,
maybe they're happy with it.
Again, this is why the fighters, if they're not, to your point, if they're not going to get off their duff and do something about it, then your silence equals consent.
Because we can't get all excited about a few guys tweeting things. In the grand scheme of things, it's really a small percentage, at least publicly.
This would be what I would say is the silver lining of this deal. If we're gonna try to find where's the positive is that if this deal were a little bit better for the fighters, but not great, but just a little bit better, there'd be fewer complaints, and maybe there would be no sentiment for some kind of collective bargaining. I think that something like this that has had such a dramatic response from a decent, not a huge amount, but at least a significant, noticeable amount of fighters might just be the thing. And I think it might have taken something that so many people found to be a loser.
The one thing that they sort of harped on too is just the convenience factor of this, because now you don't have to be chasing sponsors and going outside. I think there might be a percentage of fighters who really do like that idea. I mean, I remember, you can remember guys like Mac Danzig. There have been some fighters and through the course of time that have just been like, I really don't want to play that game. I don't really like it. So there may be some fighters who actually are okay with it, especially the most prolific fighters. This is one of those things where Joe Lozon suddenly looks like he's ran his career the right way the whole way. He never was really wanting to be in title contention. He just wanted to take fights that would be exciting. He could maybe get end of night bonuses. He was always playing the outskirt money that he could get. And now all of a sudden he's going to be up in that upper tier because he's had enough fights. I mean, by being prolific, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is just the thing that matters the most in that tier structure. But I don't know. It's the whole thing. Like you said, there's so many absurdities. You almost run into red flags anywhere. If there are people at the top, like for instance, circumstantially, Joanna and Jacek getting ready to fight for a belt. If that's good enough to headline a fight card, and that's where you could actually make some money from sponsors, that's a good spotlight and all that stuff. But yet I don't know exactly when her fight is, if it falls under, but just using that as an example.
Right before.
So if you cannot make that money, it's just, you've got somebody making $2,500 as a max in that situation as a main event. And if you're that valuable to be in that position, it doesn't make sense on any of those levels.
And you bring up a great point. I wish that there was a formula here, and it wasn't just tenure. It was maybe tenure plus ranking plus placement on the card. For example, if you make this equation where it's all right, you have 15 fights and you're ranked 3, and you're main eventing a fight night show, there needs to be some kind of bonus for that, right? I mean, you need to. So if you can figure out, and there are a lot of smart people who work for the UFC, and there are all these shows, and some are Fight Pass, and some are on FS1, and some are on Fox. I mean, I think that you should be given. Now, it gets a little tricky when you're the 6th fight and you fall on the FS1 prelims, and then you're the 5th fight, and sometimes the 6th fight is much better than the 5th fight, but you're on pay-per-view. That might get a little tricky and subjective. But if you make this formula of this plus this plus this, I feel like then we can get to, all right, who is really getting what they deserve? Because there are guys, as we all know, who are in the UFC who have 5 fights and are worth a lot more to the brand than people who have 20 fights. Yesterday, Lorenzo Fertitta said, look, if you're in the UFC for 20 fights, you're probably a big draw for us. And I can think of a lot of guys who have 20 fights who aren't big draws at all.
T-bow, baby.
I don't want to single them out, but they don't move the needle. And there are guys with less fights who do move the needle and deserve more.
But bottom line, no matter how you mess around with the deal and try to move this part over here, move that over there, it's still the UFC that's playing the game. The UFC is the one that's doing it, and that really is the bottom line. No matter how much they sweeten the pot, at least in their mind, you pointed out in the beginning that no matter how much in good faith they believe that they're acting, the fighters, it's not the fighters who are doing it. The fighters have a different perspective. Some fighters might love it, some fighters might hate it, but if you are, it's the same deal with everything that's been collectively bargained in the NFL. There are some players that probably hated the process because they thought they were getting a good deal before. But when the fighters come together and make a deal with the UFC and or with a sponsor, that is their deal. And if it's not a good one, then they should live with it.
Let me just make one point about a quasi-defense of the UFC here, believe it or not. Because when they say that, look, the reason why you have to wear Reebok during all these opportunities on fight week, we're not going to let you do anything else, is because, the only reason these sponsorship opportunities exist is because of us. And I think proof of that claim is that when you take away, or actually when you put in place those restrictions, in other words, Demetrius Johnson, you can keep your sponsorship, just not for UFC stuff, everyone goes, well, does anyone really care at that point? So when the UFC says you're getting money because we're creating opportunities for you, they're not wrong. That is, to me, 100% correct. However, it is also correct to me that when fighters say, well, that may be true, but your show literally does not exist. You can get in there and you can play the Baba O'Reilly theme and face the pain, but if there's no fights on the card, your product ceases to exist. The two realities, while they're in contrast to one another, they're both real. And the only way to make sense of it is to have the two parties adjudicate. But as we mentioned before, if the fighters aren't going to do anything,
Right.
one is going to steamroll the other.
And
Fact.
I wonder if we're barking up the wrong tree, because even in my private conversations, off the record conversations, a lot of them don't bring this up. They just complain and they're like, "Oh, this sucks, this sucks." And I'm like, "What are you going to do about it?" And they don't. This is not what comes to mind. This is not what they say.
Let me ask you a question.
So why is that?
How much news never gets reported because no one wants to talk on the record?
Yeah, but what about off the record? They don't even bring it up off the record. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's true.
They don't say like, "Man, if we only had a guy, if we only had this and that." They're just like, "This sucks. I get more here." I'm like, "Okay, and then what?"
It's
you
a
know?
it's a game changer. I mean, this is the world that they've grown up in. This is the world that they've been in. Maybe probably the fighters who've had jobs outside of fighting and maybe worked in a warehouse that was a union shop and realized that the regulations that guided the entire workplace might have a little better idea. But a lot of these guys, this is the workplace they've known their entire life as adults. And so how are they supposed to think that there's going to be a better way?
Okay, we could talk about this for an hour. We should probably move on. We're all getting fired up, or at least Lucas. I see you, red in the face.
I always get red in the face.
Let's talk about something else that came out this week. The revamping of the UFC Hall of Fame. You wrote a great article about this. I want to get your take on it. I think that one of the things, I think the UFC's done a lot of good, obviously. I mean, I don't want this to be an anti-UFC party. Sometimes that's the cool thing to do on the internet, but I feel like we're above that sort of thing. However, I feel like they don't honor their history enough. And I was really excited when they put out that pay-per-view open with Gracie and Shamrock and some of the other people. It was very well done, although lately it feels like it has evolved towards just like stars of the last 5 years or so. Regardless, I was very excited about this Hall of Fame news because A, there's a physical one, and I think that's important. And they're honest with it. They're saying this is a UFC Hall of Fame, which is fine. They're entitled to do that. And I think this wing thing, or the pioneer and fight and all that, I think it's all very refreshing. I do feel like in the announcement they should have come out and said, all right, who's going to be inducted, so we get a better sense of what they're thinking. But overall, what do you think of this? Is this something that's worth getting behind?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you'd love it to be an MMA Hall of Fame, and it was, so we were kind of talking about this on the way in, where there would be, people voting people in, because guys like Fedor Emelianenko, I always think of somebody like him, right? He's never stepped in the octagon, but he fought in Pride, which they now own the libraries for, and so you're like, does he get consideration to be in the UFC Hall of Fame, and does that even make sense? Would you want to see, you know what I mean, an exhibit of, but on whole, as just as what it is, it's a cool concept. I mean, I like the idea of the fight game, the way we cover it, and fans always are what's next. We're always looking forward. This sport has such a unique history. I feel like if there's a place that could house that and actually show just where it came from, that you'd be astonished that you're standing in a Hall of Fame, that it could even exist from its beginnings, just from where it started. To me, that's kind of a cool thing. Now, it remains to be seen how the UFC actually handles it. I like the idea that they mentioned the wings, because so many of those guys from the 90s, all the way up into 2000 were the pioneers. They were the ones who were, just sort of diving through the loopholes where they could and showing up in places and being told they had to go somewhere else and just going through all those. They were the true pioneers of the sport when it was being outlawed and through the dark ages and all that. And I think the UFC should really embrace that. I don't know how much they will. I feel like there's always just a little bit of a discomfort with, sort of distancing themselves from that. But ultimately, that's part of the sport. And everybody knows when Zuffa came in, that's when the sanctioning they started to take over in Nevada, New Jersey, everything else. That's what happened and how they've got it to where it is. So I feel like you do have different eras. And if you're able to sort of get all of that history in one place, even if it's just the UFC, I think I'm all for it.
Yeah, when this Hall of Fame was started, not as a physical space, but just the idea of it, it drew some criticism in the beginning and really over the years, and it was just criticism because we've seen so many examples of people who would seem to be shoo-ins for a Hall of Fame, but are not even being considered. They're Frank Shamrock and people like that. And obviously, it's a political. There are political reasons why certain fighters are not going to be in this Hall of Fame. So I would say that the idea of making it a physical space is an advancement in that we can think of it maybe more as a museum, as a place where the history of the sport is being exhibited. And I'm not sure when the announcement comes as to who's going to be inducted and if there are some people who I think really belong in there, and a lot of people think belong in there, but are not being put in there because they had a fight on Twitter with Dana White or something, then we can have that argument at some other point. But the idea that there's going to be a place where fans can go in and see see artifacts from the history of the sport, maybe the tooth that got knocked out in that first fight, or what? I guess that was never found. But all kinds of good stuff. I think that's a really good thing. That's an advance.
I want some microscopes with the blood slide, so you can check out whose blood each fighter's blood looks like, something like that.
Exactly.
Does the NFL control the Football Hall of Fame? I don't think they do, right?
No, it is a Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Yeah, A and B, they don't obviously decide who goes in.
Right. So to me, that's sort of interesting.
Same with the NBA.
Right.
Or basketball, I should
I'm not sure about Major League Baseball. Maybe that's different. I don't know. But certainly that's an interesting fact to me that sort of distinguishes between who goes in and how and why. But listen, the UFC has a very proud history. All this Reebok stuff aside, they took a crazy sport that was nothing, not even a sport to begin with, and they did everything that happened, and we all know the story, blah, blah, blah. 2 million in the hole, 40 million in the hole, and now worth probably several billion. It's an incredible story that deserves to be told, and they have taken ownership, it looks like, of their own history, and that's really important. One thing I would say is, look, and they have, as you mentioned before, I think it's important to know they have every right to tell the story how they want to say it, and from their viewpoint, and everything about that's going to have its own editorial slant. And you should just know that. But just like MMA fighting will have its own editorial slant, everything else. So I don't see anything wrong with that. It would just seem to me though that that's the key takeaway here. Is like they have taken the initiative to own that space, which is their right to do. It would just be nice, to your point, if someone took the ownership to own the larger trajectory, but no one in MMA seems to have the money, the time, or the initiative. So this is where we are.
And if they called it the MMA Hall of Fame, I mean, they could really then tell their history the way they want to tell it. That's a great opportunity because no one else is going to do it. No one has the time to do it. No one has the resources to do it. They could really tell the story of this sport, especially because they own those libraries in the way in which they want. I do feel like this is something that they could have capitalized on a long time ago, and I know people hate the wrestling analogy, but really WWE does it better than anyone because A, they induct people into their Hall of Fame who never stepped foot in a WWE ring. They become the Wrestling Hall of Fame, which I think is great. And B, they actually make a lot of money off the Hall of Fame. I mean, they filled up the SAP Center in San Jose the night before WrestleMania. So I don't understand why the UFC does it as this free thing at the UFC Fan Expo. I guarantee you, Friday night before UFC 189, they go to a small theater in Las Vegas, wherever it may be, Hard Rock, the Palms. They could sell some tickets to this. All these fans there looking to do something, why not make it into an event as opposed to just a thing at the expo? That's the part I don't get. There is definitely an appetite for this. Now you have at least 4 people going in every year. Perfect. I mean, actually, I'll have more if there are 2 people going in for the fight, right? So I just feel like, okay, great, let's see. I'm very curious to see who they induct, and I'm very curious to see how they pull this off and if they actually do the physical Hall of Fame, because I think it's important. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not on the same level as the Reebok deal, let's be honest. But I do think the history of the sport is important. I think the NBA does a fantastic job of honoring its history. I think Major League Baseball does a fantastic job. They're doing something at the All-Star Game where the pioneers of every team are going to be there. I think it's very important to do this. And, with the UFC 200 coming up, I think it would be great if they would do more of this kind of thing. I really think it's important, especially when you consider the fact that the sport is only 20 years old and so much has happened. You look at that footage from 1993, it looks like it was like 1965. The evolution of the sport is amazing. It truly is. All right, let us move along. I want to bring up something this man wrote. This man stirred the pot greatly this week. You have named Ronda Rousey as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, right?
You've been hanging out with Nick Diaz.
Yeah, right.
Male or female. No problem.
Right.
Ronda Rousey, #1. You did this for Sports Illustrated, and you've received some heat for this. Explain to us why you did this.
Well, I think the question. There's 2 questions here. #1, should a woman be ranked? Should a woman be in the same ranking as men in a pound for pound, ranking? And some people would say, well, some people will interpret pound for pound as a very little way, and they would say, well, if you're putting her in there, then you're saying that she can beat, she weighs 135 pounds when she competes, so that means that she can beat any 135-pounder who's below her. That would include T.J. Dillashaw, that would include Renan Barão, and that's not what I'm saying. Of course, we're not making that claim any more than I would make. I feel like trying to create a fantasy matchup between 135-pound woman and 135-pound man is as silly as trying to create a fantasy matchup between 125-pound Demetrius Johnson and 245-pound Cain Velasquez. I mean, when you're doing these kinds of it's all a fantasy world, and I think that we have to recognize that A, these rankings are opinions, and B, rankings are a fantasy world. So, having set that down, if you then believe that a woman, based upon her resume, can be stacked up the same way that you would stack up Mighty Mouse based on his resume, or Jose Aldo based upon his resume, I think it's hard to argue for somebody else. I mean, I think you can make a case for Aldo maybe, but I think it's pretty hard to argue that if you take the dominance and weigh it against the competition that each fighter has faced, I would say Rousey's number one.
And important to note that you have removed Jon Jones. That's why she became number one.
Well, then, she became,
which I think is an issue in its own right. Why did you have to remove him?
Well, because he's not ineligible. He's not. He's not eligible to be fighting. He's suspended.
He's suspended?
He's a suspended fighter, right? We just remove anybody who's suspended or who hasn't competed in over a year. Although I'm always getting emails reminding me that my number 8 guy in this division hasn't fought, so I have to adjust. But basically, Rousey has been in the top 10 for quite a while, and she moved up a little bit each time she vanquished another opponent in about a minute. She was number 2 last month, and I actually thought she would never be number 1 because I figured the one person ahead of her, Jon Jones, is never going to lose. So I was pretty shocked last week when Jon Jones was God, and we had to move the next man up or woman.
Rules are rules. What do you think of this?
Ain't no good come from this discussion. You guys know this, man. The bottom line, I don't really deal in rankings anymore, but at ESPN we used to do the same thing, and I used to hear the same sorts of things. And I almost have to, I like that you use the word parallel tracks. Like, you're looking at resumes, so you're looking at who they've faced and then putting that against another resume. So this is the only real way that I figured out how to look at it too. So in that sense, I'm sort of with you that Ronda Rousey should be there with everybody else. The one knock on that, I guess, would be that you think that Ronda Rousey's division is so weak that it shouldn't bear, it doesn't bear up against some of the other guys who've been through monsters rows in their divisions and still gotten through them. Like, I still think he's been so inactive, but I still think Dominic Cruz belongs in that discussion. There's so, just thinking of how they've handled themselves for long sustained periods. But I don't really have a big problem with putting Ronda Rousey at the top of the pound for pound, just given what she's been able to do with the people that she's faced. Not going with it, huh?
When I talk, it's like throwing pearls before the swine among this group. That was
like
mean.
that.
No, please.
Yeah, listen, I have a very hard time believing that what she's doing over there is in any way even remotely comparable to the greatest featherweight of all time, that being Jose Aldo. The resumes just don't compare. Sorry. Who is the female 135-pound Chad Mendez? Who is the analogous comparison? Oh wait, I'll stop you. She doesn't exist. Who is the?
Marmouche.
Yes, thank you. Who is the analogous comparison for Ricardo Lamas? Oh, I'll stop you there. She doesn't exist. This is a division, just an example of men's featherweight that is so infinitely more advanced than the division she's in. Is she incredibly dominant? She is the most dominant, but she's the most dominant, unfortunately, in the space and time when the rest of that division is just, frankly speaking, rather thin.
Well,
Okay, but let me ask you this. Wait 1 second. Let me ask you this. Should she be in the top 10?
I think I would not have an issue with that, probably.
Okay.
I think that's okay.
Okay, that was my question, because I feel
Does
like
she deserve to be ranked among men? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the issue, and again, everything's an opinion, and clearly I'm not arguing that women's bantamweight is on the same level as some of the other divisions, and if she were not as dominant in her division, that would bring her ranking down. But I feel like the combination of dominance, comparing, and then balancing that out with the people that she's competed against, that's where I put up there. I think Aldo has competed against maybe a tougher bunch of challengers, but he hasn't dominated people the same way. He's gone to, as our good friend Conor McGregor has said, he is a decision machine.
Sure, but I mean, look, when I think of rankings, I think of just how good you are, and I also think of your strength of schedule. Who you're fighting, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And maybe Ronda is so good that she makes everyone look so bad, but I also agree that her competition isn't as stiff. I mean, let's not forget, look, my big issue when I saw this was, is she fighting better people than Chris Weidman, who beat Anderson Silva twice, Demetrius Johnson, Jose Aldo, Cain Velasquez, when he, is she fighting better people? I also, and maybe this isn't the most popular opinion, I don't know how I feel about her being in the top 10.
Oh snap!
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know because
Don't know as in I'm not sure, or don't know as in no.
no. I really, it's like one of those things that when I start thinking about it, my head hurts because look, if we wanted to just be called the bantamweight division, should she be in there over T.J. Dillashaw? Like, do we just all include them together in the 135-pound rankings? Are they all together?
It's a difficult question to answer.
Well, there you go. So then why is it there?
But they're not competing against each other
Right.
any more than
That's right.
she's competing against women in her division. She's not competing against T.J. Dillashaw's division. She's not competing against Demetrius Johnson's division.
Right.
She's not competing
So
against
then
Jose
how-
Aldo. That's why the pound for pound is a big mixture. Look, I think that this is a these kind of arguments.
This is barbershop talk,
This is what
right?
it's all about. This is
Yes.
to me it boils down to more a question not of whether she belongs as number 1 or number 3 or number 7, but does she belong in the rankings in the first place? And I think that's really the operative question here. And that's a lot of the pushback I've gotten. And some of it, frankly, has been well thought out, like some of the stuff you guys have said. And then some of it has been sort of Neanderthal talk from people who just can't deal with the concept of a woman being ranked amongst the toughest guys in the world.
It's funny, and I'm happy you did something like this because I've done rankings in the past, and I just didn't think of I just thought these are the male pound for pound rankings because the majority of the divisions are male divisions,
And for a long time, it was just.
It was.
There wasn't.
And so this changes the way you have to think about things.
I want to toss out a shout out to one of your fellow Canadians, Dave Diebert of Post Media News. This all began when Kevin Ellie was doing was having the Yahoo pound for pound
Yep.
rankings, and Dave was one of the people in the panel, as was I. I think there were about 20, 25 people on the panel, and I always thought about Rousey, but I just didn't. But it was all men in the thing, and Dave brought up the question: can we include Ronda Rousey? And
what was the answer?
And Kevin was like, well, I gave him some thought. Yeah, if you want to. And then the first month, the only two people who ranked her as number 10 were myself and Dave. But he was the guy. He was the guy who sort of.
He's the pioneer.
He lit the fuse, I guess.
Saskatoon is in the room.
Yeah, I really don't know. I have no answer. I was just curious to get your thought process behind this and what kind of feedback you got.
Yes, I've gotten both. I mean, I've gotten some positive and some negative, but I think that's okay. As long as people aren't being Neanderthal about it, as long as they're making an argument that, well, this guy has fought a much tougher bunch of challengers, and that should supersede the dominance. That's
even
fine.
Without Ronda Rousey, and there are these types before there was a Ronda Rousey in our pound for pound rankings, it seemed like there were so many people. Oh, you're an idiot for doing this because it would show
the
who
Anderson
voted
Fedor
what.
talk,
yeah,
right?
Anderson Fedor, and then Jon Jones comes around. Then it was the Anderson Jon Jones. It's like all over GSP.
Anderson,
so it's like no matter what, you're always going to have that, but that just adds that extra element that people can't wrap their mind around.
So we've done an entire show here, and I think we've said Jon Jones' name like once, which is the complete opposite of last week. So let's end on Jon Jones this week. His manager, Malki Kawa, said on the MMA Hour this week that he thinks that there's a chance he may not fight again. Like that's an actual possibility. I was just kind of throwing that out there, like, oh, do you kind of have a timetable? He's like, no, there's a chance, and obviously he said he'd be okay with that. He supports him. Do you think he never fights again?
I don't buy it at all. No, I'm not saying that Kawa's not speaking honestly, or that's not what he may in fact think. I just think when it's all said and done, I have a hard time seeing that that was the Cormier fight was the swan song. I mean, there's MMA, combat sports is just the sport of returns and redemptions and all kinds of crazy stories like that. It's the home for people who do wild, insane things, both good and bad, or something in between. And look, I don't know what's going to happen to him legally. That's way out of my depth. But just if past is prologue, I suspect he'll probably get off without too much of a legal wrangling, and then we'll return to the cage sometime before the end of the year or right at the beginning of the next year. And that may be problematic. In fact, it may be so sudden that we don't learn anything. But this idea that we've seen the last of Jon Jones one way or the other, if it's buy or sell, I'm selling.
Yeah, I would agree, John. This is the depth of Jon Jones's professional life. I mean, think about that. The guy is riding on the top of the world champion, top pound for pound #1. The guy in the sport, and all of a sudden, all that stuff gets pulled away. Now, of course, he allegedly played a significant role in that happening, but you got to figure the guy is feeling very low right now, and who knows? I mean, we were not privy to any conversations he might have had with his manager, but it's feasible that they might have had a conversation, and Jon was just feeling like, why bother? I mean, who knows? Or maybe he just is so determined to seize the issues of irresponsibility in his life, and that's priority one, and everything else is invisible to him right now. We don't really know that, but I think that to even ask that question right now of him is we're not going to get a good answer. But I would say that as soon as he's allowed to get back in there again, he's going to get back in there.
He's just got to find his bearings. I just think there's no way that he walks away after this. How do you become who he's become without having that drive to be great? You think that will just go away, like just through some self-reflection stuff? No, he'll have to rediscover that, or maybe he has it in him. The weak person in him is being exposed right now. He needs to do away with that. Whatever the case is, that weak person's not going to end up ruling this whole thing. That's my feeling on it. I feel like he's a guy who went through a public spotlight from the time he was in his young 20s up until this point. He's had a lot of, he's bumped into a lot of walls. He's had a lot of problems, but ultimately that's just that's the weak side of him. That's his outside life, but his greatness in the cage has stood for itself, and you have to think at some point he's going to realize as his identity that that's what he's able to do, and he's going to come back. I can't foresee a scenario where he's like, nah, I'm done.
True or not, I think it was a very smart thing to say because it just kind of makes him a little more sympathetic. Please don't go.
I really anticipated that would come out at some point. Well, that'd probably be it for Jon Jones.
Also, like in the wake of the GSP thing, when you coming back, when you coming back, when you coming back. If you go out and you put out and say he may never come back, maybe it relieves some of the pressure. I mean, GSP was making sort of public appearances,
sure,
but I mean, it relieves some of the questioning around Jones about when you're coming back. More a matter of if. That kind of gives him some room to breathe, maybe.
And I also maintain, and I'm not trying to devalue the more important stuff that he's dealing with outside of the cage, but I maintain that if Daniel Cormier wins on May 23rd and starts parading around with the belt and calling himself the real champion, that will light a fire under Jon Jones.
Can you believe it? I had people being like, why would people want to see a rematch? And I was like, are you the dumbest person in the galaxy?
The rematch would make over $1 million.
Oh, I 100%.
The same people saying Mayweather, it was not a...
Yeah, Mayweather would lose to my dog in a Turkish oil wrestling match or something. People are stupid.
Cormier is the perfect person to be in that spot because he gets the promotion, and he would walk around. I mean, he's already calling it his belt. I'll give him a shot at my belt if I win, or when I win. So that would be huge for the UFC. All right, we're done. Time is up. Very busy weekend coming up, guys. We got a lot to digest. We haven't talked about Mark Hunt versus Stipe Miocic. There's a big boxing match on HBO.
Canelo,
which is weird because I heard boxing was dead after the...
They're going to revive it this weekend.
Okay, just for one night.
Put the paddles on
at Minute Maid Park. There is, of course, Metamoris, the strangest promotion in the history of promotions.
Yes,
right?
it is.
Are you going to be in attendance to that one?
No, I don't think anyone will be. And then, of course, the super fights of all super fights between RFA and Legacy.
Yeah.
Team RFA.
Your Team RFA?
I think I'm Team RFA too.
What about you?
I'm Team Don't Care.
Okay. Very well said, Jeff. If you're checking out any of those, enjoy them. We appreciate the time. We appreciate you checking out the show. We're back next week for another edition of the MMA Beat. I cannot wait for that. For now, we say goodbye. That is Luke. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.